Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about the scientific method. As in all of my classes, I will give you an outline of what we're going to cover for the day. So first I'm going to give you a couple of thought questions to think about. We'll spend some time talking about acquiring knowledge. I'll explain what the scientific method is, then I'll summarize and then tell you what to read for class next time. So our first thought question is, if we want to deter crime, should we increase the length of prison sentences? So take a moment and think about this. So our goal here is to try to figure out a way to deter crime. And someone is proposing, should we increase the length of prison sentences as a way to discourage people from committing the crime? Because the idea being, if you commit a robbery that normally would lead to 1 year imprisonment, if it now leads to 10 years imprisonment, people will be less inclined to commit that particular crime. So take a moment and think about whether or not you think that this particular approach would be an effective way of deterring crime. For our second question, given that this is an election year, I want you to think about politics. So if we want to get people to vote more, should we highlight the fact that low turnout rates are a big problem in elections? So for example, in the 2016 election, only 60% of eligible voters actually voted. So the idea here is, if we told people that people aren't voting, there's low turnouts, would that encourage people to then vote? With the idea being, if very few people are voting, your vote carries more weight. So now you should be motivated to vote because now your vote actually has more weight than it normally would. So the question is, how can we figure out the answers to these questions? Would either of these approaches be effective or would they not be effective? How can we figure that out? And this is where we're going to spend some time talking about ways in which we acquire knowledge to figure out what's the best approach that we can use to obtain information or acquired knowledge. Now, what I want you to recognize is that every day we spend time acquiring knowledge about our world, right? So which person should I date? How do I pick the right professor for Psych 311? What career should I choose? These are questions that we're constantly thinking about, and we're trying to figure out ways to determine the best answer. And philosopher Charles Peirce, in 1877, wrote the book The Fixation of Belief, which he describes 4 strategies for increasing knowledge: tenacity, authority, rationalism, and the scientific method. Some other popular strategies that I'm going to talk about are also intuition and empiricism. So to kind of help you visualize these different ways of acquiring knowledge, I've broken them up into 2 categories. The simple ways of acquiring knowledge, which are tenacity, authority, intuition, and then the more complex ways, which are rationalism and empiricism, and the scientific method. And what I want you to recognize here is that the scientific method is a combination of rationalism and empiricism. And I'll break that down in more detail when we get to the scientific method. So the question is, what's the best way to acquire knowledge? And my goal for today is to convince you that the scientific method is the best way to acquire knowledge. But before I do that, I want to highlight some of the issues with some of the other ways of acquiring knowledge. And hopefully you'll see why the scientific method is superior to these other ways of acquiring knowledge. So first we have tenacity, right? So this is acquiring knowledge by having blind faith in something, right? And you believe it under all circumstances. So the example I have here is trying to convince a 3-year-old that Santa Claus doesn't exist, right? So I tried that with my daughter and it did not go well. I told her, Daddy bought the gifts. I showed her the receipts. She wasn't buying it. She basically was convinced Santa Claus somehow came down a chimney that we do not live in. We live in an apartment. There's no chimney here. But somehow Santa came down and delivered all of the gifts, right? So she has this firm belief in something, and no matter what I say, she's not going to be swayed by that. Now, that's a little bit of a ridiculous example, but you can think of examples with like politics or religion where people hold a particular view, and no matter what evidence you provide them, their view is not going to change. So that's tenacity. Now, take a moment and think about what might be a problem if you rely on tenacity to acquire knowledge. Just because you have a strong belief in something does not make it true. right? So I'm a religious person and I believe in God, but just because I believe in God does not mean that God exists, right? So just believing does not make it true. And one of the bigger issues with tenacity is that it does not provide a way for which you to be able to correct any incorrect beliefs, right? So if you actually believe that the world is flat, there's no way to correct it and be able to now be convinced that the world is round, right? Because there's no way of changing your attitude or belief. Whatever you establish as your belief, that is it, right? Our next way of acquiring knowledge is authority, right? This is acquiring knowledge by accepting information from some authority figure, some expert like your teachers or your parents, religious leaders, government officials, right? If they tell you something is true, you believe it, right? Um, so you can think about experts said that the world is being affected by global warming, right? And hopefully we all accept those experts that are telling us this. Um, Experts say that smoking can lead to lung cancer. Right, so these are things that experts have told us, and we widely believe them to be accurate. But what might be some problems with solely relying on authority figures? Just because someone says they're an authority figure or actually has some information does not mean that they are infallible, right? So even Einstein was wrong sometimes. And some people who claim to be authorities may not truly be authorities. They might not really know what they're talking about. Um, and sometimes experts are just wrong. So there was a period in time where experts said that the world was flat, and if you walked far enough, you would fall off the edge of the earth, right? And obviously, we know that that's not true anymore. But experts told people that, and they believed it. Experts also said that people's personality could be determined by the shape of their skull, right? So again, we know now that that's not accurate, but at the time, those are widely held beliefs that authority figures convinced people of. So the key here is to recognize that authority figures are not infallible and they can definitely be wrong. The third approach is intuition. This is acquiring knowledge based on having a gut feeling or a hunch, right? So I had a hunch that he was a bad person, so I avoided him. Some kind of an instinct tells you don't do this or don't do that. My gut told me to bet on the Knicks, which again, that's a terrible bet under all circumstances. I don't care what your gut says, but your gut tells you that, so then you bet on the Knicks, and then inevitably you lose, and then you are upset with yourself. So what might be some problems with intuition? As hopefully you can recognize with my next example, our guts are often wrong, right? Um, So one example, our gut would probably tell us that if we're having a heart attack, we're probably going to want a lot of people around us so that we have a better chance of getting help, right? But in actuality, you want the exact opposite. You want to only have a few people around you if you're having a heart attack, because if there's a lot of people, what you'll end up having is the bystander effect, where everyone thinks, oh, someone else will deal with that guy with the heart attack. I'll just keep walking. You want to have one or two people there and they feel not obligated to assist you, and your chances of living will be much greater, right? But that goes counter to what our gut would tell us. You think, oh, yeah, I want a lot of people around me, right? So the trick here is to recognizing that our gut is oftentimes inaccurate. So those are the simplistic ways. Now let's move to the more complex ways of acquiring knowledge. And our next one is rationalism, also called the a priori method. Now, rationalism is acquiring knowledge through logic and reasoning. This is philosophy, right? Just to give you a couple of different examples of rationalism, and this will not be on the exam, just to kind of give you a sense of how it works, you have what's called deductive reasoning, right? So if you're taking philosophy, you've heard of deductive reasoning. And it involves going from a general principle to a specific case. So the example I used here is whatever thinks must exist. General principle, I am thinking, which is more specific, therefore I exist, right? So taking something more general and narrow it down to something specific about him as an individual. Inductive reasoning is the opposite. So when you're going from something specific to something more general. So you can say an eagle is a bird, right? That's very specific. An eagle can fly. Therefore, all birds must fly. So you're generalizing from what you know about an eagle to what you know about all birds. Now, what I hope you can recognize from this inductive reasoning example is that the logic makes sense unless you can find an example for which it doesn't hold true, right? So if you think about a chicken or a penguin, they are birds, but they can't fly. So therefore, our final premise of therefore all birds can fly is inaccurate. So what are some problems with rationalism, right? So solely using rationalism as a method of acquiring knowledge can lead us to having faulty conclusions, right? So for example, it's logical to think that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. Like if you had no information and someone said, would a 10-pound rock fall faster than a 5-pound rock that, same shape, just different weights, you would probably say, yeah, the heavier one will drop faster. And there was a point in time where everyone thought that was true, but then they tested it and they realized that they fall at the same rate, right? So using logic and reasoning would make you think heavier objects fall faster, but that's not always the case. Another problem with rationalism is that what if you have two people who are making conflicting arguments, but they're equally compelling conflicting arguments? How do you know who's correct? Is one correct? Is the other one correct? Are they both correct? Are they neither correct? Who knows? So rationalism has limits in terms of being able to come to some firm conclusions. Now, it has its place because you want to be able to use logic and reasoning to kind of form predictions or theories or hypotheses, but then you need something else on top of just rationalism for it to be useful. And we're going to talk about that one next. The next is empiricism. So this is acquiring knowledge through observation. So using our senses. This is kind of a typical way of thinking about it. And there are two different types of empiricism. Naive empiricism, where you have to directly observe something. So it's the idea of I have to be able to see it, feel it, touch it, smell it before it exists, before I will believe it. And that's fine oftentimes in the natural sciences. But in the social sciences, it's much harder to have variables that you can touch, see, and feel. Like how do you touch self-esteem, right? How do you touch prejudice? It's hard. So what we have instead is what's called sophisticated empiricism. And this is knowledge through indirect observation, right? So instead of being able to directly assess anxiety, for example, you would ask someone, how anxious do you feel? Or maybe you measure their cortisol levels, right? Those are indirect ways of getting at anxiety, but they're not exactly, you can't see the anxiety. You can see the effects of the anxiety and infer from those effects that that person is feeling anxious, right? So to give you another example, you can use a thermostat to observe heat, or you can drop an object to observe gravity. You can't see gravity, but you can see the effects of it. When something falls, that's when you know that gravity is taking place. If you're in outer space and you try to drop something and it doesn't fall, that lets you know that gravity is not present in that particular place. But you can't see the gravity or the lack of gravity. You see the effects of gravity. Right? So it's an indirect way of assessing gravity is by dropping something and watching it fall. So what might be some problems with empiricism? Well, for naive empiricism, as we kind of talked about already, some things you can't directly observe, right? So again, you can't directly observe someone's self-esteem, but you can indirectly observe it. So solely relying on naive empiricism would probably limit what you could study. For sophisticated empiricism, it only helps if you have some clear, organized way of making your observations. And if your observations are linked to something that makes clear logic and sense, right? Which we'll talk about when we talked about rationalism. And it's also to recognize that our perceptions can always be biased, or often can be biased. So even if we see something, our biases might warp our perception or our interpretation of what we're perceiving. So we can't always just directly trust what we observe. All right, so I've talked about the simple ways of acquiring knowledge, and I've talked about two of the more complex ways of acquiring knowledge, and hopefully you recognize some of the limits of those different approaches. And you might be thinking, all right, if all those don't work, what are we supposed to do to acquire knowledge? Should we just give up? Is all humanity lost? And obviously the answer is no. We still have the scientific method to fall back upon.